Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and this afternoon we're going to have a conversation with one of our senior fellows, Dominic Tierney, and moderating the discussion will be FPRI's own Director of Research and Director of our Middle East program, Stein. The topic is the future of U.S.-China proxy war. They'll be looking at the great power military competition between the U.S. and China and how it might evolve over the coming years. I'd also like to, while I've got you, put in a plug for our People, Politics, and Prose event next week, which is hosted and moderated by our very own Ron Granieri. He's going to be talking with Paul Schaefer, who will be discussing his new book, Freedom of the Border, which will look at whether borders are really necessary. And as my colleague Eli Gilman said, he will look at, do good fences really make good neighbors? Anyway, without further ado, let me turn it over to Aaron and also give you a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll be going to those questions about halfway through the program. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Aaron Stein.
Thanks, Raleigh, and thanks everybody for joining virtually on what is a very hot afternoon here on the East Coast. So I hope everybody's enjoying some time inside while we can still do these events virtually. What we're going to be doing here is Dom, who I'll introduce in a second, will give about 20 to 25 minutes of introductory remarks, talking about a piece he wrote in the Texas National Security Review. And then we will turn it over either to moderated discussion, or if there are enough questions from all of you, we can go straight to questions. For a reminder for people, this shouldn't be our first rodeo, but in case it is, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a bunch of icons. The Q&A function is where you should put your questions, and I will collect them and moderate them. If you're having problems with that, you can put them directly into the chat, and I will also be checking that frequently as well. So with that out of the way, I wanted to turn it over to our speaker, Dominic Tierney, who is a senior fellow with FPRI's program on national security and an associate professor of political science at Swarthmore College. So with that, Dom, you have a lot of other accolades, but I'm just going to leave it there. People can look at your bio on the website, and I'm going to turn it over to you to start the conversation.
Well, first of all, thanks so much, Aaron. Thanks so much, FPRI, for hosting this event, and for everyone who is joining. Looks like we've got a pretty good crowd. FPRI does absolutely terrific work, so let me just do, but it's also quite humble, so let me just say, FPRI, if you please back it and support the organization any way you can. I also actually want to do a quick shout out for a sort of piece of FPRI's work that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, which is the FPRI internship program. Because last summer, when I was writing this piece, I actually had a number of FPRI interns doing incredibly useful research that helped me produce the piece. And so that internship program is just one, element of FPRI's imprint, and it's incredibly useful. So thank you very much for that. So I want to talk today about something that I think is neglected often in discussion of US and China, which is the possibility of proxy war. And let me begin with the highest grossing movie in China of all time, which is a movie called Wolf Warrior 2, 2017, I think. And the movie involves a heroic Chinese sort of ex-special forces guy, ends up in an African civil war, saves people from these rebels. And right at the end of the movie, he discovers and fights the real bad guy, who is an American, who is sort of the puppet master of the rebels, and they have this big fight, like a lot of Hollywood movies. And it ends with the American saying to the Chinese hero, he says, "People like you will always be inferior to people like me. Get used to it." And then the Chinese guy says, "That was history," except he adds an expletive, and kills the American. Then the Chinese Navy turns up and just obliterates the rebels. So the movie is, of course, a little silly, a little far-fetched, but this notion that China and the United States may, if they're not already, soon be squabbling, meddling, competing in foreign civil conflicts, I actually think is very apt. So the core puzzle I'm going to talk about today is, as China and America emerge as rivals on the world stage, and as that competition sharpens, what shape will military conflict take? And the focus, I think, has overwhelmingly been on the possibility of conventional interstate war, some big naval battle. And people have tended to neglect the much more likely scenario of competing in foreign civil wars, or in other words, proxy war. So why does this matter? Well, I actually think this is really, really significant. For one thing, the overwhelming conventional wisdom, if you go to DC or in the kind of think tank world, is that we have pivoted decisively from the era of counterterrorism, that was the post 9/11 era, that's over. And we're now in this new chapter, which is great power competition, sometimes even called GPC. And there's this decisive shift. So terrorists, insurgents, that's all gone. Now it's great power rivalry and interstate conventional competition. But actually, I think that future great power competition is likely to take place within insecure states and in the context of civil wars, and will often involve non-state actors, terrorist groups, rebel groups, and so on. So it's a much more a complex story, and there isn't this sharp pivot. It's also important because in the modern era of civil wars, the United States has struggled militarily, as all of you are very aware, losing most recent wars. I mean, we're seeing that with Afghanistan, with Iraq, maybe with Libya as well. Often it's been outmaneuvered by adversaries like Russia and Iran. Well, now the United States looks set to compete with China in these conflicts, and neither side is really ready. And there's a significant risk of escalation, or actually worsening the civil wars themselves. All right, so I'm going to spend about 15-20 minutes sort of taking you through some of the highlights of the article and of the research and of the argument. And of course, if you're interested, ask questions, or maybe you can have a look at the actual piece, which is available without a paywall online. So the big story, I think, of the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years is this dramatic shift in the strategic landscape globally, where we've gone from the US basically asking China to play a greater role in world affairs, to be a responsible stakeholder, sort of inviting China to bear more of the burden of global stabilization and counterterrorism and so on. We've gone from that to, in the Trump administration, the US labeling China as a strategic competitor, and then Biden recently in the State of the Union saying the United States and China are competing to win the 21st century. So essentially there is this consensus in DC, or near consensus, that China is a massive threat and is really should be the focus of American foreign policy, and even the focus of American domestic policy, since Biden is selling a lot of progressive investments in terms of competing with China. So how will this competition be channeled in terms of military conflict? Well, interestingly, both China and the United States tend to downplay any possibility that they will end up meddling in foreign civil wars. So the United States tends to prioritize the possibility of some big interstate war with China, conventional war in East Asia, or a naval battle around Taiwan or the South China Sea. And you see this focus very much on conventional interstate war in nearly all recent American national security documents, which again really focus on this pivot from the era of counterinsurgency to great power rivalry. And talk about Beijing's rapid military modernization, the need for huge investments in high-tech US technology designed for interstate war, the latest aircraft carriers, the latest fighter planes, and so on. And so the assumption here is that military conflict will be conventional, regional, naval clash in the South China Sea, let's say. Well, interestingly, China also tends to downplay the possibility of any kind of meddling in foreign civil wars. One of the most fundamental and long-standing principles in Chinese foreign policy is non-intervention. The idea that China will not meddle, will not get involved in another country's domestic politics. This dates back to the 1950s. It's actually literally written into the Chinese constitution. And the reasons for this principle are fairly obvious. For one thing, it can sort of deter other countries from meddling inside China. That's something that the Chinese, of course, resist ferociously. But also it can send a signal about China's peaceful rights. It's not a threat to other countries. It will always respect their sovereignty and never get involved in internal politics. So both the US and China tend to downplay the possibility that this is going to be an arena for competition. However, I think that proxy war is far more likely than this interstate war that is the focus. And the reason for this, the fundamental reason, is that the nature of global conflict has changed fundamentally. Since World War II, there has been a significant shift globally away from interstate war, armies meeting on a battlefield, sort of your classic wars, toward civil wars, and especially internationalized civil wars. So internal conflicts where other countries get involved and sort of meddle. So why are these interstate wars so rare? Well, it's a number of different explanations. Some people point to nuclear weapons. Some people point to democracies not fighting each other because of what's called the democratic peace. Other people talk about trade and interdependence between countries, or maybe it's institutions like the UN. But whatever the explanation, it is clear that interstate wars have become extremely rare, so that 90% of wars today are civil wars. Virtually every conflict that you read about in the news is a civil war: Syria, Ukraine, Somalia, Libya, and so on and so on. After all, nuclear weapons might stop Pakistan and India from having a full-scale war, but they won't stop Pakistan from facing an internal threat. So civil wars become predominant, and crucially, the way that states compete now, it's actually by meddling in these foreign civil wars. So they are often internationalized. I think Syria would be a sort of exhibit A for this, but you could also look at Yemen as another great example, and Libya as well, and we could go on. In fact, arguably things like technology have made it easier and easier to meddle in other civil wars, whether it's from using social media accounts and propaganda right through to shipping weapons. So how will this shift in sort of the structure of conflict affect US and China? Well, I would suggest that an interstate war, a kind of classic war, is extremely unlikely. The two countries have not come close to an interstate war for really half a century or more. And all of these barriers, or nearly all of them, are in place. Nuclear weapons, they're very interdependent, they're both active in institutions, and so on. And so military competition is much more likely to take the form of proxy war. And what I mean by proxy war is that Washington and Beijing will support in some way rival actors in a foreign civil war. So perhaps one side will support the regime, the other side will support rebels. And by proxy war, I don't mean that they will literally send in their ground troops. That might happen eventually, but that's not really what I'm focused on. I mean indirect forms of support. So it could be kind of obvious, like, shipping weapons to a favored side, but it can also be quite subtle, financial support, or even things like, training or propaganda, or maybe even, protecting your side at the UN and making sure there isn't a UN resolution you don't like or something like that. So a lot of ways you can do it, but the China and US will end up supporting different actors. This kind of proxy campaign has long been tempting for outside actors. Why? Because it's pretty cheap to ship a few weapons to the rebel group. It can have a huge impact on the war, but actually it can actually be pretty costly and dangerous. Partly because sometimes these what seems a pretty easy intervention can escalate in unexpected ways. Might think about the US and Vietnam, for example, but there's a lot of other cases as well. And crucially, you often don't control your local surrogates, and they may go off and do things that you can't predict. So why is the United States going to meddle in foreign civil wars if it's so focused on interstate conventional war, right? For the US and China to clash, then both sides need to meddle. So why would the US meddle? Well, the answer is that despite the American kind of comfort zone, the American way of war being these interstate conventional wars. I think that's what most American soldiers sort of think their mission is, to be warriors. Despite that, the United States has routinely involved itself in foreign civil wars in every way imaginable, from sending massive numbers of troops, but right through to all kinds of indirect meddling. It's partly just American power. It's partly American values and idealism, sometimes pushing sort of more humanitarian types of operations. So you see in the Cold War, the US, of course, waged many different proxy conflicts, like backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s, a famous example. But more recently, proxy war was a key part of the war on terror. Sometimes the US supported regimes through sort of security assistance, but also supported rebels like backing the Kurdish side in Syria, for example, and there are other examples as well. And I don't think this is going to end. You know, even Biden, who the last thing he wants is another Iraq war. He's trying to get out of Afghanistan. Is still, you know, launching airstrikes against militias in the Middle East. So there's no sign of this going away from the US side. So that's pretty kind of obvious, I think, that the United States is just a hyper interventionist country. It is the most interventionist country in modern history. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. The real puzzle is why China would get involved, right? Because of course you need two to tango. You only get a Sino-U.S. proxy war if China also steps in and supports one of the sides in a civil war. And remember, China is committed to this sacred principle of non-intervention. So why would it tear that up and meddle? Well, the answer is that in reality, China has always been ambivalent about this supposed principle of non-intervention. You know, it's hard for a country as powerful as China to completely stay out of a civil war, even if it actually wants to. And in practice, it often doesn't want to, because like other great powers, it has interests and seeks to protect certain things in the conflict. So if you go back to the Cold War, you know, I said this non-intervention principle stretches back to the 50s. In the Cold War, despite this principle, China was routinely supporting, you know, what they called wars of national liberation, shipping weapons to rebels throughout Africa and in Asia as well. It's true then that in the 1980s, it sort of stepped back from that and had a lower profile, but China supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. There are a couple other cases as well, never completely sort of isolated itself from civil wars. And since the war has ended, although China is nowhere near as interventionist as the United States, by a country mile is less interventionist, the trend line has been for greater intervention and Chinese involvement in civil wars through tools like arms sales, through tools like action at the UN, through propaganda, through different economic investments, and interestingly through peacekeeping, where China is actually, of all the permanent members of the Security Council, the one that's most involved with peacekeeping. So why would China, you know, get involved in these civil wars? It would seem to be, you know, all downside. Well, in part, it wants to protect its core interests, especially the Taiwan issue. So, for instance, it has pressured actors in civil wars to adopt the one China position and basically break ties with Taiwan. It also is concerned with border security. So, for instance, has supported rebels in Myanmar to protect the border with China. It has a rivalry with India. And India has long accused China of shipping weapons to rebels in northeast India. China denies that, but there's a lot of smart experts who think there's some truth to that. China's helped the Sri Lankans crush the Tamil Tigers in 2009 by, for example, shielding Sri Lanka at the UN. And that also might have been part of a plan to sort of shift the balance of power against India. China, of course, has huge economic interest with the Belt and Road Initiative, and that provides a major incentive to, you know, make sure that the debts are repaid and provide a modicum of stability in Africa and elsewhere. Pakistan, for instance, has been the site of huge Chinese investment. And I think that's also a significant investment, a significant reason for Chinese involvement in Sudan and also South Sudan, where China is a major player. Both those two countries have endured civil wars. China's worried about terrorism. For instance, the Uyghur fighters in Syria is something China is focused on, and China has provided some support to Assad's regime. And also an increasingly important issue is protecting the Chinese diaspora. So there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese in Africa, and increasing issue is protecting Chinese who are, for example, you know, kidnapped or otherwise threatened, and you know, that can evoke things like nationalist and domestic political pressures on China to have the back of Chinese abroad. So what we're seeing is broadening Chinese interests in the last few decades, which are likely to only broaden even further. China's growing capabilities are also a dynamic that's important that will only increase in the future, provides the temptation to act, and nationalism, which seems to be becoming more significant, all pushing in the direction, I think, of getting more involved. So let's bring this all together. The US is hyper-interventionist, China is much more cautious, but is becoming more interventionist. And so therefore, what will happen when these two interventionisms meet? That is the question. And so I just want to start out by saying it doesn't necessarily mean a proxy war, right? The two countries could intervene in the same direction. They could partner in foreign civil wars. They could sort of push the outcome in the same way. And this, after all, was what the US was really pushing for not that long ago. It was only in the Bush administration that the US wanted China to be a responsible stakeholder and actually get more involved. China and the US could, on paper, be a great team. They have sort of different, friends and allies. They have different capabilities, and they also share quite a few interests, especially in things like counterterrorism and fighting piracy and things like that. There are some cases where this has happened, like in South Sudan, they're fairly aligned. Afghanistan, on paper, might seem a natural case where China and the United States could work together as the US is desperate to get out without seeing the country completely collapse. But I think that kind of partnership approach to foreign civil wars is difficult and is becoming less likely. Why? Because of this overall paradigm of strategic competition, which encourages a zero-sum mindset. Where a win for one side is a loss for the other. We're not quite at the Cold War yet, but we're moving in that direction. There are, of course, also ideological differences as well. And so what you're going to see is that the United States will look at foreign civil wars through a new lens. So back, in the post 9/11 era, early 2000s, the US would look at foreign civil wars in places like Afghanistan, and what the US was worried about was primarily terrorism. And so if China will come in and help stabilize the country, great, because anything that deals with radicalism and terrorism is the problem. I think it was Gates who said that the United States was actually more threatened by weak countries than strong countries. So through that paradigm, it's just instability, chaos is just a problem, and we've got to deal with it. And anyone can help, get on board. Well, if we shift that paradigm and rival with China as the predominant concern, then it fundamentally changes how the US looks at these foreign civil wars, because instability is not the key criteria, right? What matters is how that instability feeds into the overall competition. And if it ends up hurting China more than the US, maybe America can live with it, or maybe if things get even worse with China, the US would actually kind of stoke that instability. So it completely changes, like a lens, how you look at these foreign civil wars. So I think that we're going to see some type of proxy conflict emerge. The two sides, for instance, have a long history of using different kinds of proxies. They did fight proxy wars during the Cold War in places like the Congo and elsewhere. You could even see Taiwan as being a US proxy, of a kind of proxy. China has even used things like fishing vessels, commercial fishing vessels, as proxies to pursue its goals. So in other words, in coming years, internal conflicts in places like, say, Venezuela, Pakistan, Myanmar, even let's say if North Korea collapsed, could become arenas for competition. So what will this look like? Well, I just want to be clear here that I don't think, at least in the medium term, that you're going to see the kind of, massive, heavy-handed proxy wars that we saw in the Cold War. You think of Afghanistan or Vietnam or something like that, right? You're not going to see that. Instead, what you're more likely to see is subtle, deniable forms of competition that might even sort of blur into what you might see as like normal international relations. Some arms sales, some economic support, feuding behind the scenes at the UN, cyber operations, propaganda support, a lot of these kinds of things. More than necessarily massive arms shipments. You might even be, at least in the medium term, that Washington and Beijing compete in one civil war while sort of getting along okay in a different civil war. And you'll see a kind of patchwork effect. So, if Venezuela, for example, collapsed into civil war, it's quite plausible that China and the United States would fight a proxy war. Why do I say that? Well, they already recognize different regimes. China recognizes the Maduro regime, the US recognizes the Guaido regime. And so if you did see a civil war, that might well translate into what would effectively be a proxy war. Myanmar has also, since the military takeover, moved closer to a civil war. And you're already beginning to see Myanmar as a kind of maybe early stage proxy conflict. For instance, the US was pushing for a UN arms embargo, and China resisted that. China is much more friendly toward the regime. So if the US started pushing for things like freezing assets, a travel embargo, pushing for criminal charges against the junta, and then China resisted that, you could begin to see the early stages of proxy conflict. So just the last point I want to make is, what's the implication of this? What would happen if we began to see subtle, deniable, but nevertheless proxy wars emerge in, let's say, the next 10 years or so? Well, I don't think that these conflicts are going to necessarily, spark a full-scale interstate war between the US and China, fortunately, for the reasons that I already mentioned. These barriers to interstate war will still exist, like nuclear weapons and so on. But the intervention could still escalate in unexpected ways. History is full of examples where countries, began meddling, thinking, oh, I'll just send a few weapons to one side, and then it just grew and grew and grew. Why? Because they didn't understand the conflict, and particularly their side looked like it might lose. And having their side lose was just intolerable. And so they just escalated. We saw that, for example, in Syria, which, Aaron knows better than me, that each side would just sort of increase its escalation to make sure that the other side didn't lose. And so Iran steps in, and then the Gulf states step in, and so on. And that can really exacerbate things. Now, this is particularly important when the outside powers don't really understand the conflict. And the United States has displayed ignorance of, a lot of these wars that the US has got involved with in Iraq and in Afghanistan and so on. And we could see the same thing. China is even more ignorant about a lot of these complex foreign conflicts. It doesn't have NGOs like the US does. It doesn't have a network of, foreign diplomats with the same kind of experience. So there could be a kind of clash of ignorance. And a particular danger with this type of proxy war is that you don't, in fact, control your surrogates. Just think about how the US struggled to control Baghdad in Iraq and get the Iraqi regime to sort of do the right thing as the US saw it. Or just think about how the Ukrainian rebels shot down a civilian airliner a few years ago. And it does seem, we don't know the full story, it does seem that was an accident. Well, that's the kind of thing that can happen once you meddle and once you provide weaponry and so on. And then, of course, you have to deal with the consequences, and that can lead to an escalatory response and so on. And then, of course, even if it doesn't lead to a Sino-U.S. full-scale war, it could worsen the war itself and lead it to spill over into the region with huge consequences. So lastly, what should the U.S. do? Well, I would push Washington to yes, think about, this big showdown, this big naval battle, aircraft carriers, et cetera, but broaden American thinking about military conflict with China, and think about the fact that in a world of civil wars, the most likely scenario for military conflict is in the context of a civil war. And so that means, training and preparing for different forms of intervention, having officers study proxy wars and the dangers of proxy conflict. I would also say pick and choose American interventions much more carefully. So the US tends to wade into a lot of these conflicts without really thinking through the consequences. And I think as the China piece becomes more significant, that's another reason to be very selective and careful about these types of missions. I would add that the US should be very careful about sort of seeing these civil wars in terms of, oh, let's worsen it and then get, that'll harm Beijing. Well, we tried that in Afghanistan, and yes, it did push the Soviets out, but of course we know that in part it was also the roots of Al-Qaeda. New threats emerged from that. Although it's going to be difficult to be partners with China for various reasons, we could look for areas of shared interest. I actually think Afghanistan might be one of them. And if a proxy war does happen, then of course the key thing is to manage it through confliction protocols, for instance, and other types of mechanisms designed to stop it from escalating and try to keep things managed. So that more complex world, I think, is the one that we're facing, and it deserves greater attention. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Dom. And I want to encourage everybody to use that Q&A function so that we can begin to, sorry, my Alexa started talking to me. That was a little odd. So that we can begin to involve everybody in the chat. But Dom, while people are collecting questions, and we do have one, I as wanted to take the moderator's prerogative to jump in and pick up right where you left off, because I was taking notes throughout, and I had a sort of two-parter here, which is one, and is, you know, refining a little bit, talking about how you define proxy war, because, you know, there's certainly a large scale from, you know, indirect intervention, you know, the provision of weapons and training, perhaps that was captured in that Chinese movie, versus something that escalates to the role of Vietnam, both of which you cited. So digging into a little bit about that. But in general, the rule of thumb is about supporting sides in these types of civil conflicts, is that when you intervene, you tend to intervene on the side of the losing side. And so that your weapons and guns aren't enough to necessarily tip the scales of that civil war, but are enough to keep it at a stalemate, therefore making it longer and bloodier. So do you think, with what you were laying out, that in this sort of new era of GPC, that it's going to be a whole bunch of serious, right? Which are these open-ended, long conflicts that lead to failed states, rather than, you know, victory by one side or the other? And with that, before you answer that, and then I'll turn to the questions from the audience. So please do keep them coming. So Dom, the floor is yours.
Sure, both terrific. Absolutely right. I mean, you need to define these terms quite carefully, and I think the key distinction is between direct intervention and indirect intervention. So direct intervention would be with actual ground forces, or maybe also air power, in a civil war. And then indirect intervention is where you don't have that, but you still make an attempt to manipulate the civil war in some way. So you know, the United States, of course, is routinely engaged in both these types of interventions. Direct in cases like Afghanistan would be a great case, but indirect in a lot of other examples as well, like Afghanistan in the 80s. Afghanistan does seem to be a common case that we've talked about here. So the key point is that these indirect interventions can cover the gamut from, you know, what might seem to be relatively minor or innocent kinds of actions, like, you know, shielding one side of the UN Security Council, or, you know, providing economic assistance or something like that, and then right through to, you know, really shipping huge amounts of weapons. You know, like, think about the ways that Iran basically helped Assad early on in Syria, really a key times. Now, what I would say, though, is that even those indirect interventions can be extremely significant. So, you know, economic support, or, you know, shielding certain actors of the UN and preventing sanctions from happening, things like this, you know, they might seem relatively innocent, below the radar, or maybe just like normal politics, but actually can hugely impact the course of the civil war. And so we should measure intervention in terms of the amount of impact it actually has on the course of the civil war, and even some of the sort of what might seem more minor forms of meddling can be enormously significant there. So a proxy war is basically where you have two indirect interventions. So the US and China are both sort of one step removed, and they both indirectly help one of the actors. The most likely scenario is that the US is supporting a rebel group of some kind, and the Chinese are supporting a regime, let's say in Venezuela or Myanmar or something like that. But there are other ways you could think it through, and that's the scenario I think is most likely. Actually, we could see in time a situation where China does in fact directly intervene, and the People's Liberation Army's capabilities for you know, launching an expeditionary intervention are increasing. They're far behind where the US is, but that's something there's a lot of attention on. And China's already doing, for example, a lot of peacekeeping. So you could begin to see that. I don't think you'll see that in the next 5 to 10 years, but that could be, you know, if we do this talk again in, you know, a decade or so, we may be talking much more about direct interventions by the Chinese. On your second point, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these interventions are designed to stop a favored side losing. And one of the reasons for this is what psychologists call loss aversion, which is that we just don't like losing. Losing hurts twice as bad as winning feels good. So China and the US, they could probably, live with their side not winning, but their side actually losing, just a clear-cut defeat. It raises all kinds of reputational issues, both domestically, the leaders don't like to look terrible in front of their people, but also in sort of the global image as well. And I would say, what was the biggest reason the US was fighting in Vietnam? To avoid losing. That's what it was. That was the number one reason, was just, it didn't want a clear-cut, unmitigated failure and loss. And that, of course, can lead to these conflicts potentially just stalemating, because the US and China will just, start out with a light touch, but as their side looks like it will lose, the touch gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And another problem here is that, and this comes back to the ignorance point, is that we're assuming that everyone accurately assesses who is losing, right? But actually, in these kind of complex civil wars, it's incredibly difficult to know who is winning and who is losing. So you could have a situation where, China and the US are worried their side is losing, and maybe they're not really losing, but they nevertheless step in. So absolutely is the possibility for this kind of fear of loss to sort of create these escalations and interventions as we sort of grow and grow.
Thanks, Dom. Well, we have two questions from the audience, and they pick up here, and they both have to deal with Latin America. So I'm going to combine them into two. One's from Maria, one's from Carlos. Given your definition of proxy war, this is from Maria, do you see China's challenges to the US and Latin America as a proxy war of sorts? And then from Carlos, and I think they go well together, is how do you, more broadly zooming out, how do you evaluate Latin America as a field of intervention for China, and putting them together? What do you think those implications are?
So I think Latin America could well be an arena for proxy war going forward. As I said, if you define proxy war as the US and China essentially trying to manipulate a civil war in opposing directions through indirect tools, then it's very likely that we're going to see that in some way, shape, or form. I think Venezuela is probably the leading candidate for where you might see a proxy war emerging. We're not yet at the definition of a civil war, so hopefully this never happens. But a lot of the pieces are in place for a Sino-U.S. proxy war, right? I mentioned in the remarks earlier on that the United States and China recognize different regimes. Well, as you probably know, the United States has actually labeled Maduro as a narco terrorist, and so the framing of the Venezuelan conflict is polar opposite. China has provided enormous investments into Venezuela, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, and China, of course, wants to get that money back. So if hypothetically, and of course we hope this doesn't happen, but if Venezuela were to collapse into full-scale civil conflict, and it is a destabilized state where something like 4 million people have fled abroad, right? But if it were to collapse into a full-scale civil war, then the United States would be extremely likely to favor the opposing rebel side. After all, the US sees Venezuela as part of the American hemispheric zone of control. China, meanwhile, would be extremely likely to continue to support the Maduro regime, right? Why would China sort of immediately abandon the regime, right? After all, it's got to consider its global reputation. It would think that Maduro is the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. So when you think about those dynamics, how the US would be very likely to offer some degree of support for the rebels, China would be very unlikely to abandon the regime immediately. Immediately, you have some form of proxy conflict, and it could easily escalate. I think the key dynamic is that the United States historically has been extraordinarily sensitive to great power involvement in the Western Hemisphere. That is arguably an element of American grand strategy going back to the revolution, pushing foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere, right? After all, that was the Monroe Doctrine, right? It took a long time. The British controlled Canada for a long time, and but it's a consistent theme. The Cuban Missile Crisis, right, and the fear of Soviet influence in Cuba, right, and many other examples. And so the notion that Venezuela would become a state closely aligned with China, with, let's say, a Chinese military base or something like that, I think that would be considered intolerable for Washington. And so it's very easy to see how a civil war in Venezuela would escalate. And Venezuela is maybe an extreme case. And I think the other cases in the region are probably much less likely to turn into a proxy war quickly. But those same dynamics could align, particularly when you consider the speed with which great power relations are changing, the speed with which China and the United States have really locked horns in this strategic competition paradigm, the speed with which China is growing its economy and military capabilities, the speed with which China is boosting its peacekeeping capacities, and now it has its first military base in Djibouti, and so on and so on and so on. The situation is very dynamic, and I wouldn't want to predict what relations will look like in Latin America in, say, 10 years.
So I want to pick up and ask about something in a little different way. Is that when the way you're describing, these proxy conflicts and the potential for friction between the two great powers is one over either supporting regimes or giving support to, insurgents or rebels on working against regimes, and perhaps the two sides taking different, taking on, different sides of that conflict, and then, giving either diplomatic or military support to those sides. But, if you look at, how would you then, there's two things. One is that I think where a lot of the friction's coming about now is not necessarily in these indirect proxy conflicts, but in ways that challenge American conceptions of the liberal international order or the rules-based order, which is, again, a nebulous concept that nobody really agrees on, but something along the lines of building artificial islands in the South China Sea to make claims upon territory that very few countries actually recognize, or that the countries that do recognize have been beaten into submission to recognize, either through economic inducement or the potential of coercion. So maybe expanding and getting your thoughts on this proxy conflict, not necessarily as being with guns and diplomacy, but being in using the rules of the road in creative ways. So asymmetric land grabs. And then building on this, the concern in the U.S., I would say, watching the early days of the Biden administration, is around Taiwan and whether or not the Chinese have reached that point where they've gone over that sort of threshold where they have the capacity to quickly retake the island, and whether or not that would incentivize them to do so. So curious to get your thoughts on both of those.
Yeah, I absolutely think that this connects to the kind of the liberal international order debate, which for those who maybe haven't followed as closely, is this notion that, particularly since 1945, the United States sort of led an order that is unique, I think, in modern history, and is rules-based. So the US, through creating institutions and encouraging trade and democracy, has created an order that has largely sort of stabilized world politics, diminished interstate war, connecting back to the point I was saying earlier about the changing nature of conflict, and also, according to its proponents, led to rapid advances in human rights, in global democracy, and in global prosperity. Now, the proponents of the order fear that the emergence of China represents a fundamental threat to the global liberal order, because China simply does not subscribe to some of the key tenets of this order. Now, I should say that there are plenty of critics of this notion of a global liberal order. There are plenty of folks who think that it is somewhere between exaggerated and mythical, that the United States has often, in fact, torn up the rules that it wrote in order to pursue its own agendas. What I would say is that the battlegrounds of the global liberal order have often been historically in these civil wars, and they probably will be in the future. So, if you look at the places where the order was threatened, at least in the US, but it was often these civil wars. It wasn't just, the Red Army massing in Europe for a big tank battle. but it was in places like Vietnam or in places like Korea, which, although it was an interstate war, was also a civil war at the same time. And a lot of the norms associated with the global liberal order have also been challenged in these kind of civil war contexts. So one of the norms that has emerged is responsibility to protect, and this notion that outside powers cannot simply respect sovereignty and allow a government to massacre its own citizens, but in fact, in extreme cases, outside powers have a responsibility to protect those civilians themselves, in true extremists, necessarily through a military intervention. And it will be interesting to see how this next chapter of Sino-U.S. rivalry in civil wars actually affects some of those norms and so on. Because my suspicion is that the United States will be willing to sacrifice some of those norms in certain conflicts if it thinks it will give the US an edge in the particular conflict and hurt China. However, it could also go in the other direction, where it could be that rivalry with China actually sort of forces the United States to kind of raise its game and redouble its commitment to the global order. After all, the reason that the US built all of these institutions and encouraged trade and so on was not because the US suddenly, after World War II, became idealistic. It was because the US faced terrifying threats from the Soviet Union and from a fear of a repeat of World War II. So whether it sort of ends up reinforcing the order or not is very much up for debate. The second point you make is also great, which is Taiwan, and it's of course the kind of the number one flashpoint. And a couple points here is, firstly, it's often put forward as, well, this is where the interstate war will happen. And so this is what the focus is on. And I think that if there were to be an interstate war, probably Taiwan is the most likely. I happen to think it's not that likely, but probably the most likely scenario. But there's a couple ways in which Taiwan can feed into the argument that I've presented. The first is that Taiwan is itself a kind of proxy. It's not a proxy war in the sense that I've been talking about, but it's an American proxy, showing that both sides are willing to sort of use these arm's length actors to pursue their goals. The other way in which you could feed into the argument is if a war did happen and China did invade Taiwan, it's very likely that Taiwan would not be immediately governable. It's very conceivable to imagine an insurgency existing in Taiwan against the invading People's Liberation Army. And in that situation, the United States would face a very significant dilemma about whether to support the Taiwanese rebel actors in a Taiwan. In that case, it's actually supporting the insurgents, not repressing the insurgencies, what we've usually been doing in recent years. So that, of course, would not be a proxy war because China would actually have intervened with a direct intervention. But it would nevertheless be an extreme example of a foreign civil war being an arena for Sino-U.S. competition. And that would be extraordinarily dangerous if the United States was shipping weapons or otherwise supporting Taiwanese insurgents. And I think the Taiwanese military plan is to fight the Chinese through all ways, including unconventional tactics. So that's not a totally implausible scenario.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess maybe the last question here, and then I'll give you a few minutes to wrap up, is, a lot of it's been looking backwards and then looking now in the present at Taiwan. I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing to do in think tank or academia, which is to look forward, right? With all the variables we can't control, is potential hotspots for this type of proxy or indirect conflict in Asia. Right, or in Asia, or around the world. I mean, we don't have to limit it there. Leaving Taiwan out of it, or expanding on your Taiwan thoughts as well, is just looking into the future. It's like where there could be these places for indirect conflict that could probably bring in, or at least try and bring in the two dominant powers. So with that, the floor is yours.
So of course you should never make predictions, especially about the future, as to steal a line. And so I'll speak in broad brushstrokes, but nevertheless, we can say a few things. The trend lines are clearly for heightened Sino-U.S. competition, and it's hard to imagine that going into reverse and anytime soon. Just look at politics in DC, just look at politics in Beijing. That, for the medium term, seems set. I don't know how quickly it will intensify. Maybe it's slower, maybe it's faster, but it looks like that competition is going to continue or worsen at some pace. Secondly, it seems overwhelmingly likely that China will become more involved in the internal politics of foreign powers. Extraordinarily powerful dynamics are all pushing in the same direction. Economic investment, greater capabilities in the People's Liberation Army, as well as greater capabilities of shipping weapons and things like that, greater concern with counterterrorism, greater involvement in UN peacekeeping, and so on and so on and so on. So it's hard to imagine China doesn't get more involved in these types of conflicts. Do I think that China is just going to turn around and say, okay, we no longer believe in non-intervention, right? We guys, it's over. I know it's in the Constitution, but it's over. No, they can never abandon the principle of non-intervention. For obvious reasons. If you abandon it, then you're basically saying we are a meddler, we are an intervener. So what they will do is do ever more heroic efforts to sort of somehow reconcile greater intervention around the world with somehow being committed on paper to non-intervention. And we're already seeing that, right? So they'll say, well, if the UN is involved, then it's not intervention. And if it's a civil war that spills over into other countries, then it's a regional security issue, and that's not meddling. So you'll see that. Now, where then are we most likely to see these conflicts? Well, when the piece came out in the spring, I thought, well, this could, maybe take a while before we see the first one. In the piece, I suggested Venezuela might be the first candidate for a proxy war. And then Myanmar happened, right? And straight away, you are seeing, you can debate whether it crosses the threshold of proxy war, but you are absolutely seeing China and the United States with different interests in Myanmar, pushing different perspectives, different policy positions, and already dueling at the UN. China is coming out and basically saying, it's an internal issue and we support the regime. And it is quite easy to imagine the Biden administration sort of stepping up some indirect forms of pressure against the regime that you might deem eventually to have reached that threshold of a proxy conflict, particularly because the violence in Myanmar is pretty bad. There is a pre-existing civil war with various rebel groups in certain, because Myanmar is a very complex country, it's complex ethnic politics. So Myanmar is a candidate, partly because it sits right next to China and has huge strategic significance. Another candidate I mentioned is Venezuela. It's interesting because it's for the same reason, but it's the mirror image, right? The US sees Venezuela as part of its backyard. China sees Myanmar as part of its backyard. And that, of course, means that at least one of the two great powers is absolutely not willing to lose. Other candidate countries I think we should keep an eye on. Pakistan, where China is becoming more and more involved. Chinese workers have already been attacked by Baloch separatists who see the Chinese as a threat to their interests. China's worried about what it sees as radical Islamists in Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan is a keystone of the Belt and Road Initiative. So if the civil war in Pakistan were to worsen, it's very likely that China would be supporting the regime in various ways. And where the US position is unclear. Afghanistan is an interesting one where China and the United States sure ought to be working together because the US is so desperate to get out. I think we just left Bagram airfield sort of in the middle of the night without even telling the Afghans. And the US wants to get out and wants to stop the Taliban from winning. Well, the way to solve that riddle is to try to get China involved and get at least Chinese investment and support. But it's proven very difficult to form a partnership, even in Afghanistan. To give you an illustration of this, up until a couple of years ago, UN resolutions authorizing the UN mission in Afghanistan explicitly referenced the Belt and Road Initiative. China was very keen that there be a reference to the Belt and Road Initiative as an example of kind of investment that we needed in Afghanistan. And then a couple of years ago, Washington said that language had to be removed from the UN resolution. There could be no reference to Belt and Road. So of course, that's because the US is more and more concerned about Chinese influence and so on. But Afghanistan might be the case where a modest increase in Chinese influence is something that we could live with for these wider goals. And then in Africa, this is where China is pushing the envelope more. It's very involved in South Sudan, has peacekeeping missions in a number of countries, quite involved in Mali, it's quite involved in Sudan. It can push the envelope, partly because it's so far away from China. But interestingly, that's actually probably the region where you are seeing some cooperation between China and the United States, precisely because it's not as intense a security issue. So the two countries are cautiously cooperating on South Sudan. China has gone along with a Western mission in Mali, and there's a sort of a degree of cautious cooperation. So I think that, sort of just to, I know we're pretty much out of time. To wrap up, I would say, you know, everyone is focused on US-China. I think we should worry less about a big naval battle and think much more about this sort of complex patchwork of civil wars, where war blurs into peace and peace blurs into war, and there's no clear resolution, and forms of intervention are complex and hidden and deniable, but still potentially extremely dangerous. And we need a great deal more attention on, how these Sino-U.S. dynamics are going to play out in places like Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Venezuela.
Thank you for that incredibly comprehensive look, at this nuanced issue. I happen to agree with you on the likelihood of U.S.-Sino competition being indirect rather than direct, for a whole host of reasons that you articulated in your Texas National Security Review article, that everybody can access if they are interested by looking in the chat box. We put a link there, and if you have not looked in the chat box and you want to Google it, it is called The Future of Sino-U.S. Proxy War, and it was from the spring 2021 edition. And as Dom has already mentioned, one of the nice things about Texas National Security Review is that it is not behind a paywall. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody for attending. Thank you everybody for their questions. And I want to plug FPRI one last time. Dom already did a great job by playing up our interns, but we do a lot of work on FPRI across the world, looking at various hotspots, including our newest program, which Dom mentioned, or at least indirectly mentioned in passing, which is our Africa program, which we plan to do a lot more work on great power competition between the US and China on the continent itself, but also around the world. So if you like our stuff, if you like our events, please do head on over to the website, fpri.org, to check it out. And if you are so inclined, become a member, because there are even more fun stuff that you can do. And you can do that by looking at the far right of the webpage under the support function. So with that, thank you everybody for joining. And Dom, it's great to see you. And thanks for joining us, and congratulations on your Room Raider review, which we learned about off camera, but which all of the participants can now see that you got a 9 out of 10, a little more light to get a 10 out of 10. So with that, thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing everyone in person soon.
Yeah,
Cheers.
Until very soon, my friend. All right, have a good day, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.